Good afternoon and welcome to this year's Ann Baum Elder Law Lecture. This lecture memorializes Ann Baum, a benefactor of the College of Law, who had a special interest in social policy generally, and in particular the issues relating to older people in the United States. I am pleased to thank Joel Friedman, the executor of the estate, who had worked with me in helping create this endowment. He would be, and Ann Baum would be, especially pleased to have today's lecturer, Professor Ann Alstott, the Joaquin Bierman Professor at Yale Law School. Before Ann started an academic career, she worked for the storied Wall Street firm of Sullivan and Cromwell for 3 years, and then for the U.S. Treasury Department in Washington. She has taught at Columbia, Harvard, and Yale Law Schools, and is the author of several books, including The Stakeholder Society, that I've regularly used in my tax policy seminar. She is here, however, because of her more recent work, including a book inviting us to rethink retirement in a new plan for old age. Please join me in welcoming to tell us about law and the 100-year life, Professor Ann Alstott.
Thank you all for being here today. I know you have a lot of demands on your time, so thank you for making the time. I'm grateful to Dick Kaplan for inviting me, and I'm certainly grateful to Ann Baum and her family for endowing this lecture. Elder law is, I know a number of you are in the elder law class. It's an incredibly important topic. I think Dick is ahead of his time in teaching it, and I think it's only going to be more important in the coming decades. So I want to begin with a fact that stunned me when I heard it, and a fact that motivates this lecture. So if you're ready, here it is. The majority of children born in rich countries today can expect to live to more than 100. Put another way, more than 50% of babies born today in the United States will be alive 100 years from now. This isn't a fringe statistic. It's not from the National Enquirer. It's a statistical projection from social scientists at Berkeley and the Max Planck Institute. And of course, it is just a projection. And unfortunately, nature and man might intervene in all kinds of unpleasant ways to upend that statistic. But for purposes of this lecture, let's take the statistic at face value and take this chance to think. What kinds of challenges will society confront when human beings routinely live to age 100 and beyond? And, for our purposes, how can law shape better rather than worse outcomes? Now, scholars are just starting to grapple with the reality of what two British professors, Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, termed the 100-year life. So I'm going to adopt their term, but since we're law people rather than business people, I'm going to take things in a different direction. To put all this in context, as recently as 1960, life expectancy at birth was only age 70. So in the span of my lifetime, we've gained 30 years of life expectancy at birth. Now, of course, there are a small number of people who live to age 100 today. And so in a sense, each one of us probabilistically has to contemplate that we'll live that long. Still, I think society will look very different when 100 is the median expectation rather than an outlier. So to take just one benchmark, as we think this through, many of us will live 50 years after our children are grown and out of the house. That extra 50 years is not likely to fit into today's categories of retirement or a short empty nest period. It means fully half of our long lives will be lived after we've raised children and sent them on their way. Now, when I mention this statistic to friends, colleagues, and family, do try it. It's a wonderful Rorschach test for how people are feeling. But when it tells you a lot. When I mention this to people, I get one of two absolutely polar responses. The first group of people light up. They imagine a 100-year life with more time for reading and writing and getting to know their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and trying all kinds of new things. The other group of people, and it's actually hard to predict who's gonna be, you'd think it'd be easy to predict, it's not easy to predict who falls into each group. The second group of people react with horror. They imagine long, long years of isolation, loneliness, being housebound and poor and lonely. So in this lecture, I want to make 2 points about the 100-year life. The first is that the 100-year life, as stunning as I find it, does represent the continuation of social and economic trends that are already underway. So we do already have some evidence on what the 100-year life will look like, whether people will be healthy or unhealthy, able or facing disabilities, and how people will use their extra time. Some of that evidence we'll see is hopeful, some of it is not so hopeful. My second point is that we can and should think about the role of law in shaping social change. Now, even for this audience, law might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you contemplate living 100 years. Your first concerns might be with money or health or family. Will we be healthy and able during those longer years? Will we have to work until we drop? Will our marriages endure over such a long span? And how can we meet our family obligations when we have to live 30 more years? But I want to argue to you that law does have a central role to play as society addresses these concerns and more. Law will, for better or worse, shape our employment options, our families, and in constructive or destructive ways. Perhaps the best news from this perspective is that the 100-year life isn't an exogenous shock. We have time to plan, we can see it coming, and we need not be taken unawares. Now, the 100-year life poses new questions about our entire lifespan. For example, in the work that I referenced earlier, Grattan and Scott think about the impact of the 100-year life on very young people, on people essentially law student age, wondering how should education look if you're educating yourself not for a 40-year career, but for something like a 70-year career? How do you prepare for something like that? Right. I see certain raised eyebrows there. Or how do you prepare yourself for 50 years of retirement, right? How do you get that job that's going to fund that? We'll raise our eyebrows at that one too, right? So, but I'm not going to focus on young people. I'm just not going to do it. This is a lecture on elder law, and I think it's really interesting to focus on the latter portions of that life stage. And so that's what I want to do. It's interesting to focus on all of it, but I want to focus on the latter portions of that lifespan. When people live to 100 rather than, say, 70, what will the extra 30 years look like, and how can law make a difference? So I want to begin with some social and economic trends, just to set the stage for the 100-year life and what we might expect people to do as they contemplate this. So we're already living in an era of unprecedented social change. What sociologists call institutions are the social arrangements that give structure to our lives. Retirement is an institution in this sense. So is marriage an institution in this sense. So is inheritance. All of these are conventional categories that give us some idea what to expect at different life stages. So these social institutions help individuals organize their lives and plan for the future, but all of these institutions have already been shaken up profoundly since the mid-20th century, and they're continuing to evolve. So what do we know? Take retirement as the first example. Now, those of us born in the mid-20th century may think of retirement as a natural life stage. Time to rest after spending our 40-year career working. But if we take a really long view, or even not a really long view, but if we take even a semi-long view, retirement itself was a new institution in the 20th century. Retirement didn't exist until roughly the second quarter of the 20th century. It's not that people didn't live to age 65. Plenty of people did live to age 65 and beyond. But the difference is that there was no particular social institution devoted to older adults. They worked as long as they could work, and when they couldn't work anymore, they would turn to family, or if they didn't have family, they'd turn to charity, and that was just the way it was. But two developments changed all that. One was the advent of employer pensions in the private sector, and the other, of course, was Social Security. These financial arrangements that, of course, grew out of the industrialization of work helped create retirement at age 65 or so as a social institution. For the first time, the great majority of workers could anticipate a period of leisure and financial security without work. And importantly, without relying on their children, one of the signal contributions of Social Security, and it's fascinating to look at the history on this, is that both parents and children preferred to live apart if possible. And Social Security made that possible. And so retirement communities sprang up in the Sun Belt, and retirees, this group that we now think of as an age cohort and a political group, retirees became, for the very first time, a political interest group defined by a common life stage and set of institutions. But by the late 20th century, retirement had begun to change again. And this is because of a whole bunch of different social and demographic factors. For one thing, longer lifespans have on average brought longer periods of health and ability, not, in fact, longer periods of illness and decline. Rates of illness and disability do still tend to rise with age, that's true, but a large majority of people are healthy and disability-free, or at least able to accommodate a disability well into their 80s. That's true now. So these gains in longevity and ability have accompanied a radical change in the experience of old age. Today, age 65, and at least some of the people in the audience will agree with me, age 65 no longer marks old age, or the end of work, or a withdrawal from the world. Instead, our 50s, our 60s, our 70s often bring a midlife transition to new careers, new businesses, volunteer work, a whole host of new activities. Instead of leaving the workforce, older adults are downshifting. Instead, some people take bridge jobs, they take volunteer positions, some start new businesses. I was kind of amazed to find out that 15% of new businesses are started by people over 60. Right? So, and you know, these trends are just in their infancy. You can never predict whether trends will continue, but this is the best evidence that we have. So sociologists have coined a term, the third age, to distinguish this life stage, this active older life stage, from traditional retirement. In this new stage, roughly between age 55 and 80 or so, people have begun to engage in a new period, a new life stage of self-reflection and self-reinvention, deciding with some deliberation how to spend their time before true retirement is what they want. Putting all this together, it seems likely that people will not structure their 100-year life to spend 30 more years in retirement. Instead, it seems likely, as far as we can tell, that the third age will take even firmer root, so that many people will use their extra 30 years of life to pursue new ventures, try new things, even forge new identities. You know, this is fascinating because that's a psychological set of tasks that we associate with much younger life stages, right? In earlier models, people of my age and older have fixed identities, and we're supposed to be dealing with decline. But this longer life stage may very well upend even the psychology of the life cycle. To add a sober note, though, there is already tremendous inequality in this otherwise happy world of the third age. The average gains in longevity for people over 65 have not been equally distributed. By 2008, there was a gap in life expectancy, again, at birth, between high and low education groups. So again, looking at the life expectancy at birth of high-income people and low-income people, the gap in longevity as of 2008 was 14 years. So if you were born to a low-income family, you were likely to live. Again, these are all averages, but averages can be useful. You would have 14 years less. And lower income people, we know this from study after study, are more likely than their wealthier counterparts to experience disease, including hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. And we know also that disability hits lower earners much harder and much earlier than it hits higher earners. Now, over the same, so that's longevity and something that's very basic, health and ability, right? That's inequality, I should say. Inequality in health and ability. We're going to see not everybody's going to be able to take up this self-reinvention, self-definition life stage. At the same time, we've also seen inequality growing in other spheres of life. So since the mid-20th century, probably most of you know that real wages for the lowest wage earners have fallen and the dispersion in wages has grown. So the result, thinking about older life stages, is that low-income folks often reach retirement in very precarious financial shape. They are least likely to have private pensions, and even Social Security, as absolutely welcome as it is as a near universal source of retirement income, is often very, very limited for people who have had low lifetime earnings and the typically interrupted job trajectories that are characteristic for that group. So the result is that many lower earners reach their 60s now without sufficient resources to fund retirement or choose a fulfilling downshifted job or any of those nice things. That group scrambles right now to make ends meet in their 60s, just as they did at earlier ages. They continue at their jobs or they pick up part-time work for the money. Now, and we'll deal with the consequences of that for retirement policy and health policy in a little bit, but just continuing the kind of sociological survey, we've also, over this period, roughly from 1970 to today, we've seen an enormous change in patterns of relationships, particularly marriage and marriage-like peer relationships. For decades now, the American marriage rate has been falling. And today, if you take a snapshot, only about half of Americans are married at any given time. Now, that might seem like a lot of people, right? You know, if half of people are married at any given time, until you realize that that same statistic in the 1960s was 80%. So 80% of adults were married at any given time in the 1960s. Today, 50%. And the trend line, that's a really steep trend line in social science. You don't often get trends sort of that robust, right? At the same time, we're seeing, an interesting fact is that we're seeing rising divorce rates among people aged 50 and older. Right? So again, going along with this idea of the third age as a time for reinvention, there's a new term, gray divorce, to capture the large and increasing number of marriages that are simply ending at age 50 and above. So as we look ahead, the impact on family life for older Americans is going to be striking. Today's older generation doesn't yet face the same scenario, right? Today's retirees, for the most part, lived mid-20th century lives. And so for the most part, people who are older adults now followed that mid-20th century pattern. They married young, they had children with their spouse, they stayed married to that same spouse, they will retire with that same spouse. Again, but as by contrast, in really the coming decade or two and then accelerating thereafter, many Americans will be unmarried as they reach their 50s, their 60s, and beyond. Many more people will be cohabiting. We see larger rates of cohabitation, right? That was once a shocking thing that, college students did, but now we see cohabitation across the life course, right? Many more people will be living also in blended families, right? Blended families with children from other partners than their current partner. At the same time period, a rising percentage of children have been raised by single parents. You may know that today, again, just to take a snapshot, 2 of 5 children are born to unmarried parents. 2 of 5, 40% of children. And that, again, is one of these trend lines that goes up, and it's transcending social class, right? What we also know, unfortunately, is that the financial toll of single parenthood can be very, very significant. All else equal, single parents, people who've been single parents, reach their 60s with lower lifetime earnings and less retirement savings. So all of these family changes will affect how older people experience the 100-year life. On the upside, at least if you're kind of a social liberal as I am, on the upside, the decline of marriage signals new freedoms for people across the lifespan. Older people, like younger ones, now have more choice in their relationships and how they structure them and what they mean. They can leave bad relationships, form new ones, and so on. But on the downside, the decline in marriage has also and will also leave more people to face old age alone. And that means without the earning power or pension support of a partner, without the health care support of a partner, without the emotional support and social support of a partner. So, thinking about single parents in particular, an extra 30 years of life might be helpful. You might say, well, once these children are grown and gone, single parents can recover some lost ground and really prepare themselves for retirement. That's a happier story. The less happy story is that the extra years will just bring more of the same. Low-wage work, low-skilled work, and more years of hard work without a whole lot to gain. So, in hindsight, the mid-20th century was a time of compressed social patterns, right? Work, family life, retirement, all followed pretty universal patterns. Of course, there were richer people and poorer people, but really it's quite amazing if you look at the mid-20th century and you see that patterns of wages, patterns of retirement, patterns of marriage, childbearing, they were all pretty compressed across social classes. That compression is now shifting to thinking like lawyers. When social life is compressed like that, when you can predict that a lot of people will live similar lives, that's an incredible gift to you as a policymaker because you can design legal defaults and social programs around the average life, and the average will fit most people, the great majority of people, very, very well. Unfortunately, as we're seeing more dispersion in health and ability, in work patterns and income, in retirement options, it's no longer going to be as attractive and as easy to design for the average and see it fit most people. So one of the challenges is that we have to think about law for very unequal lives in a way that we haven't had to do before. So turning now to law, I think the critical challenge as we think about the 100-year life is for law to anticipate social change and help society in ways that help society adapt in ways that are both productive and fair. Now, lawyers with a Burkean cast of mind, and that may be a large number of lawyers who have a Burkean cast of mind, might find it tempting to keep law out of the social fray for now. Why not just wait on the sidelines and change the law, if at all, when society has changed, right? In other words, why not let law lag? Just see how things go and then as we need to, in very incremental fashion, we can change the law. But I actually think that this seemingly cautious approach, wait and see, would produce radical effects. The law inevitably blesses some ways of life and burdens others. Left unchanged, our mid-20th century institutions that defined retirement, that defined inheritance, that defined family life, left unchanged, those legal rules will privilege some people over others, and often in unintended and arbitrary ways. So to take just one example, pension law. Pension law, I would say to you, is already dysfunctional. Policymakers in the 20th century predicted, and it was reasonable at the time. They were smart people. They were making a reasonable projection, right? Somebody likely will make fun of, our projections today at some future time. I know they will. But in the mid-20th century, policymakers predicted that most workers and their spouses could draw on 3 sources of retirement income, right? That there would be Social Security, there would be a workplace pension, and there would be savings. That's the so-called 3-legged stool of retirement policy. And all of those, the law anticipated that all 3 sources of retirement income would work together. Unfortunately, changes in work and family and business organization and finance have shredded that retirement policy and have shredded retirement security for all but the most affluent people. As of today, already, without a 100-year life, more than half of American households are reaching retirement with not enough money to live, even at a fairly modest replacement rate. As we move toward a 100-year life, we need to repair and really rethink the foundations of retirement policy. Now, to take a less dire and happier example, law can make a positive difference in the quality of the 100-year life. Take anti-discrimination law. Anti-discrimination law, thinking about prohibitions on age discrimination, on disability discrimination, on disability accommodations, all of that has already helped open up these new work opportunities for older people. Public law has helped reduce the incidence and severity of diseases that once, again, thinking about the mid-20th century, killed people on average in their 60s and early 70s. So heart disease, stroke, cancer, there have been enormous victories, fed in part by law and by government action. So new legal innovations could do even more. Housing law. I'm not going to say much about housing law, but I wanted to say something because it's so fascinating. Housing law affects residential options. It just does, right? The law could nudge us to build, say, walkable cities with plenty of recreation and public transit, things that are especially welcome to an older population, or the law could continue on its current course and instead reinforce the suburban model of housing that tends to isolate people, especially when they can no longer drive and when they can no longer meet the expectations of the nuclear family with small children that need to have spacious yards and be driven places. So this understanding of the relationship of law to society suggests a really broad agenda as we think about the 100-year life. Law can and does shape nearly every sphere of life. Now, in our time together, in my remaining time, I'm going to focus on just 2 examples, employment law and family law. But I hope that the prospect of the 100-year life will motivate you to think about your own fields of expertise and study and think about what the 100-year life might mean. So start with employment law. When we think about living an extra 30 years, I don't know about you, but for me, employment is one of the most pressing issues that comes to mind. Will people have enough money to fund an extra 30 years of life? And how will people fill their time? Now, as I mentioned, retirement funding is already a problem today, when retirees expect much less than a 100-year life. Social Security was not meant to bear the burden that it's bearing right now. For too many people, Social Security right now is the sole source of retirement support, and it simply wasn't designed to bear that burden. 42%, right, nearly a majority, 42% of workers have no workplace pension at all, and those who do have a workplace pension often accumulate very, very small sums, reaching retirement with IRA or 401k balances on the order of, $50,000, which might sound like a nice chunk if you got it right, if it were a one-year chunk. It's not an awful lot of money. It's really no money at all when you think about living another 20, 30 years. Now, unfortunately, lower earners and minority workers are the least likely to have private pension plans. Private savings, other than home equity, is nearly non-existent for most people. I'm out of the low-income group now. For most people in the United States, most families in the United States, private savings, other than their home equity, is pretty much non-existent. And tax incentives, which Dick and I know something about, are highly dysfunctional. They basically reward wealthy people for doing what they would have done already, which is to set money aside, and they offer very little meaningful assistance to the people that most need to save for retirement. So we obviously need a better way to fund retirement, and the 100-year life, I think, adds weight to addressing this problem sooner rather than later. Now, there are a lot of good options for reform. It will take some political will to get it done because it requires a kind of long-term planning that, shall we say, our current politics doesn't really embrace. But setting aside political dysfunction, what could we do? So one priority, I think, should be to reform Social Security so that it takes account of the growing inequality in the riskiness of modern work and family. And I've written about this. If we do nothing, if we leave Social Security alone, this program that was intended, this wonderful, I find Social Security kind of a heroic program. It was intended to really provide a universal baseline of support for older Americans. If we do nothing, the promise of that program will die, and it will become more and more a program that pays out disproportionately to higher earners and to affluent families. So another priority should be to reform retirement savings options. Ideally, we should have a low-cost, portable option that is not tied to a single employer and not subject to predatory financial practices by financial managers and employers. Some of you may know the federal government already has actually a terrific program called the TSP, or the Thrift Savings Plan. If anybody wants to know more technicalities, I can tell you. But in other words, it is quite feasible to create a program that would assist retirement savings for all workers. And, again, nodding at Dick's and my shared expertise, we badly need reform in the tax incentives for retirement. So along with savings, so that's the financial piece of it, we really have to think about work options for older people. Right? If this third age is going to continue and if people are going to be able on average to work longer. Now, working longer may sound unappealing, right? On any given day, especially as it gets close to 5 or 6 o'clock, the idea that you might have to work longer is really not a fun one. But the 100-year life, if it is, as we already see, characterized by increasing health and ability, is likely to really change how we see a lifetime of work. We certainly already see people choosing to stay in their careers longer. We see people changing careers, taking on part-time work and less pressured work. So a lifetime of work doesn't have to be a lifetime of the way you worked in your 30s. It can take on a different shape if people can plan for those longer years. And so the law has a role to play by assisting people in expanding work options in this way. For example, current pension rules can make it difficult or impossible for older workers to work part-time while also collecting a partial pension. And there were good reasons for that at the time, but it's probably not going to be a functional rule going forward. So at one time, part-time work was disfavored by the law, and for perfectly good reasons. Part-time work on average correlates with poorly paid work, contingent work with few benefits. And so when the law disadvantages part-time work, there's a well-motivated reason for that. But the 100-year life may open up decades of life in which part-time work is a highly preferred option. We see it already among people that have that option. Academics, a large number of my colleagues, as they reach their mid-70s or so, are taking up the option to work part-time. I like that idea myself. Phased retirement, that's what I'm talking about, where you have phased retirement, where you have a period of 3 years or 5 years or something like that, where you're working part-time, has already become an attractive option for many people, but it wasn't even on the radar in the mid-20th century when these rules were designed, right? Retirement was in the mid-20th century really a 65 and you're out kind of rule, and many corporate policies and legal rules are designed around this idea that basically we don't have to regulate work or anticipate work by people after age 65, 66, 67. So the task we're talking about is that the law is going to have to provide in some way for the older people who can work, but going back to the cautionary statistics, we're also going to have to provide for a substantial minority of people who will not be able to work, even particularly full-time, but some of them won't be able to work even part-time. This is, again, this group of people that I'm talking about that already reach their late 50s. I mean, there's a really terrible profile of folks who reach their late 50s. They have injuries, they have disabilities, they've often had difficult physical jobs or very, very stressful jobs. They get to their late 50s and they kind of limp along. Often for a few years, they're not eligible for disability. They kind of hang on, and right now they can hang on to age 62 because that's early retirement for Social Security. And so if they can hang on to age 62, they can at least get something. The problem then is accommodating both the fact that many people will be able to work longer while also not burdening the people who are not going to be able to do that. So this is this problem of dispersion that I talked about. So I'm not going to take a really deep dive into the details here because this is what my old age book is about. But if we think about how to accommodate this range of work options, there are really a couple of options. The first option, which I think actually is not a great idea, is just to raise the retirement age. Right? Look at the statistics, raise the retirement. If you look at the statistics, you can defend, and it's not really a very hard case to defend. You can defend a policy that will set the retirement age at 80 in the near future. Right? If you really just wanted to be very Dickensian and say, how long can people work, right? You could just raise the retirement age at 80 and say, well, anybody that can't make it to age 80, that's what the disability system is for. But I don't think this is a great idea, and the reason is that the disability system doesn't work right now, right? Even under existing law, where there's much less pressure on the disability system because people can take retirement at 62, right? You get a lot of people who are de facto disabled who just exit with early retirement. If we get rid of the early retirement outflow option, we're going to put enormous pressure on the disability system. And meaning largely Social Security disability, but also supplemental security income, both programs. Disability determinations, when you do it on an individualized basis, when you try and look at an individual and say, do you meet the total disability criterion for getting disability benefits? Those determinations are arbitrary, they're expensive, and they are skewed to people who have lawyers. Of course, we like that sort of, but they're skewed to people who have lawyers and who have the financial wherewithal to do a number of appeals and wait for years before they collect. This is not a functional system for throwing in millions of extra people into the system. So if that's not a great option, what is? Again, I defend this more in the book, but I think one of the ways you can take pressure off the system is to redesign Social Security to kind of anticipate. It'll be a rough cut, but to anticipate on some kind of rough cut basis who is most likely to need early retirement, who is less likely to need early retirement, and to offer everybody a set of essentially universal options, but that will essentially cushion earlier retirement for relatively low earners. Again, I could put up graphs or something, but it's a little bit wonky to do that, so I won't. But there is actually a way that you could keep Social Security as a universal system and then offer people based on their lifetime earnings profile, maybe on their job type profile, although I'm less certain about that, offer people a menu of retirement between, say, ages 62 and 80 on either relatively more generous terms for early retirement or relatively less generous terms for early retirement. So that's, one piece of dealing with inequality. We should also expect that the 100-year life will add new pressure, extra pressure on anti-discrimination laws, especially age discrimination laws. Today, the universal retirement age of 66, 67 in Social Security, again, tends to channel older workers out of the workplace. If you're somebody who's encountering age discrimination, and of course it's very hard to know, right? Why didn't you get that job? Why couldn't you get an interview? And so on. But if you're facing that kind of situation right now, early retirement or on-time retirement are just relatively pleasant ways to put that behind you. You grab retirement benefits and you say, I'm not going to fight the litigation. I'm not going to try and prove that it was invidious discrimination or whatever. But the more we move to a world in which people want to be employed into their mid-60s, late 60s, 70s, and even their 80s, the more we're going to have to take seriously the task of fleshing out, what does age discrimination mean? How do you know if it's happened? What should be the remedies of people who believe that they've suffered it? And, taking into account potentially perverse effects of regulation, how do we ensure that stronger age discrimination regulation doesn't deter the hiring of older people to begin with? That's a dynamic that we worry about now, is that we believe, studies have shown, that employers sometimes now will hesitate to hire an older person because they worry that if that person doesn't work out for, non-age related reasons, the employer will face an age discrimination suit. So we have to work on options that can kind of thread that needle, really. I think, all of this is about the financial piece of work, thinking about work as how we pay our bills, but there's also, work also serves social and creative functions, and we need to think about that as well. Supporting part-time work is one option that I've already considered. But as I was thinking about all of this, I wondered about volunteer work, right? Many active retirees already have taken up volunteer work. And, for the most part, they're locating opportunities on their own, in their own communities. But if we look ahead to a population in which the median person lives to 100, I wonder whether, and this is truly just a wondering, I have no plan for this, but do we want to anticipate that there will be this productive and available pool of potential volunteers? Should we, in some more systematic way, connect people with need? Right? If you can imagine all of these folks that are going to be available, they will differentially, just because education rates have been rising over time, they're going to be a relatively healthy, relatively well-educated, older workforce. How could we tap into that? And maybe make use of their help for schools, for nursing homes, for community service. All right. So the last thing I want to think about is family law. Now, when it comes to families and the 100-year life, I think we're really in the least charted waters of all. We can predict, as I have, that, and it's not my prediction, it's based on other people's social science research, they predict that more and more people will reach older ages never having been married or otherwise not being married at the time. More and more will reach old age being single parents. We talked about that. Blended families, cohabitation, all of that is going to really change the face of family relationships at older ages. Now, these changes, the prospect of these changes, raise huge questions for the default rules that we set in family law and inheritance law. Now, we generally think that legal default rules should map onto what most people would want, right? Or what would be socially productive, and we often mush those two together and say, yeah, what most people want, that's would be socially productive. And in the mid-20th century, this compression of social patterns that I talked about, and in particular the near universality of the lasting nuclear family, made defaults relatively easy to set. But as we look ahead to much more diverse patterns of family life, the law is really going to face new challenges. So just take one concrete example. It's just kind of a generic example. Suppose you have a woman who first got married in her early 30s, very common, and had 2 children with that first spouse. That couple divorces, they get a gray divorce in their 50s, and the woman remarries in her 60s. So she's on her second marriage with a second spouse with whom she doesn't have any children. And her new spouse has adult children of their own. So the legal questions, again, this seems so commonplace. How many families do you know, right, that fit something like that pattern? Certainly many people in my own family fit something like that pattern. But the legal questions really are numerous. So, one, from a family law perspective, concerns the law of marriage itself. Family law today marriage means one thing. Under family law, it means one thing, and the law of marriage was developed on a mid-20th century model of a nuclear family that raised shared children. Right? That's what our alimony laws are about. That's what, obviously child support is about. That's what property division is about. And in fact, we could go beyond that and say that in the mid-20th century model, there was a very definite and anticipated gender pattern to all of that as well, right? That you'd have a male primary breadwinner, you'd have a female primary home caretaker, they would remain married, and if they did divorce, then the law had to apportion property and alimony in ways that took account of that child-rearing relationship. But that model of marriage is already outdated, right? Gender roles are changing. More and more women work outside the home for long, long periods. More and more married women out-earn their husbands, and same-sex couples who are now, thankfully, legally allowed to marry in every state, often have very different roles in marriage than heterosexual couples have had. So there's enormous change within marriage, even for the younger group. But given our focus on elder law, how should we think about marriage at older ages, right? Should we think about it differently? So just to take one example, we might think about marriages, think about people who marry in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. We might think of these as primarily companionate marriages without necessarily the mutual financial commitments that characterize those much earlier child-rearing marriages. Older marriages also are more likely to involve adult children from prior marriages, right? People often will have had children from prior relationships, and parents may want to prioritize their children over their new spouse. I think we should at least think about, and again, I don't have a solution yet, but I think we should at least think about the possibility that the law of marriage and the law of divorce should look different for those couples. The default rules, at least, should look different for those couples than they should for one of these much earlier child-rearing marriages. And it may be that alimony and property sharing should look very, very different. The prospect of the 100-year life also has ramifications for earlier marriages. How should we think about the obligations of 2 spouses that may live to be 100? Right? It's one thing right now to get a divorce at, say, age 50 and pay alimony to somebody who's going to, work for 15 years and then retire. I think it's a very different prospect of paying alimony to somebody who's 50 and who will work for 35 more years and live to be 100. So all of that, to what extent should the law think about divorce? Say, there's a body of law, right, that treats age 50 for divorced women in particular, it's very gendered, treats age 50 for divorced women in particular as like the end. They have no life left, they're never going to get remarried. Really, people make these arguments in court about the poor women of 50 that are just, they need tons of alimony because it's just over. And that's distasteful, right? It's distasteful even now, I will say. But, looking ahead to a 50-year life, I think we have to grapple even harder with questions like, to what extent should the law require or anticipate that people will reinvent themselves rather than relying on a past partner for support and so on. Now, of course, the law in most states, and increasingly so, grants wide latitude to people to have prenuptial agreements, right? But older people, like younger ones, may not like to negotiate that prenup. And so we have to think that default rules will remain important for older people as well as younger ones. Now, the final thing I want to talk about has to do with inheritance. Right? When we no longer expect people to remain, here's just one issue, right? When we no longer expect that people will necessarily remain married to their co-parent for their lives, the traditional priority, financial priority given in inheritance to spouses may need to be rethought. Right? Again, thinking about a couple, this sort of model couple that has gotten together, maybe in their 50s or their 60s, and they have children from prior marriages, it may be that you don't want the wealth that you've accumulated during your life to go to that new spouse. You may very well want it to go to your children. At least that's a common thing that we see. Now, some people might. Some people might want a different arrangement. They do. They do anticipate that their spouse will inherit, but the law is going to have to, in some way, wrestle with that. Health care and social insurance may also need to change as we anticipate the 100-year life. Think about the health care. Defaults for health care instructions. Would people want their spouses necessarily to be the ones giving those end-of-life instructions? Or would, again, they want their adult children to have priority? I think that's much less clear than it once was. And so these are really important default rules, not least because there's likely to be a diversity of expectations. Again, some people will want that spouse to act for them, some people will not necessarily want the spouse to act for them, and so on. Now, the problem of inheritance, the last thing I want to say about inheritance, isn't just for the very rich, right? We sort of think about inheritance as for people with lots of money, and so maybe it might seem like a marginal issue, but it isn't. People even of much more modest means have something that they want to pass along, whether it's equity in a home or even, a more modest amount of money. But already today, for people at this income level, say the middle class, right? For the middle class, the big issue is Medicaid. Right? The big issue is Medicaid and long-term care, because people often need long-term care, and yet the Medicaid rules require, essentially, boiling it down quite a bit, the Medicaid rules require one spouse. If one spouse needs nursing home care and the other spouse does not, the Medicaid rules require the couple to devote pretty much all of their assets to the ill spouse, and they can leave a well spouse with very, very little to live on and little or nothing to leave to the children. That is not true of unmarried couples. And so already the Medicaid rules, people often find out about them too late, but already the Medicaid rules are putting a thumb on the scale against marriage at older ages. I mean, honestly, I tell my friends, don't get married unless you are rich enough that, long-term care is something you'll just pay for out of pocket. Anybody who thinks they might need Medicaid probably shouldn't marry. And that's just odd, right? That's just odd to have to give people that advice. So, I think, and you probably agree, that I've only begun to really look at the surface of these issues. There's so many issues, and they require so much scrutiny and analysis. But my point to you was that this incredible leap in longevity is just going to upend and challenge our legal rules and our legal defaults across a range of activities. A couple of more way out things just to end with. What about the institution of inheritance itself, right? If we live to 100 or 110, does it make much sense to leave money to our 80-year-old children? Does that even make sense? Should we, right? What is that? Or should we think about generation skipping in a new way, not just as a tax category, but really as something that you plan for? I can't get my head around that, but it's something that we should really think about, right? When would inheritance be most functional for younger people? Even with a 100-year life, I can't imagine that the 80-year-olds really are the best target for that inheritance. Maybe we should think about grandchildren and great-grandchildren, right? Funding education, or for our midlife grandchildren, funding re-education, because if they're going to live to be 100 or 110, they may very well need to retrain or otherwise need assets in midlife that we don't think about right now. For that matter, and again, on the way out, but really interesting side of things, what about parenthood? I started this lecture by saying that the 100-year life means we'll have 50 years after our children are grown and gone. But that observation itself is anchored in current reproductive practices, right? Alternative reproductive technologies have already made it possible for women in their 50s and I think 60s to bear children. And certainly men have, for a long time, had the option of having children at older ages. Maybe the prospect of a 100-year life will shake up all of that as well, right? Maybe you have one set of children when you're younger and you have a second set of children when you're older. Many of us are saying, I'm not doing that again. But maybe it changes the nature of being a grandparent, right? When a grandparent is no longer somebody who is, ready to retire, facing ill health and so on, but a grandparent is a very active person with decades, maybe that changes. I think it's already changing. I see it changing. I don't know about you, but in, my family, what grandparents can mean in some families is really changing. And so we have to think about social and legal change there as well. So all of that, I think is fascinating. I hope you think it's fascinating too, and I look forward to talking to you in the reception afterwards. Thank you.